This judgment of the century basically says, hey, everything that was done beforehand is wrong. It's not the case.
Back with Eduardo Tapia. Thanks for your time, Eduardo.
Sure.
Got a couple of questions here for you. I got an email from a potential buyer, and it is about the quote-unquote trial of the century in Cabo San Lucas, where there's a lien against all these properties within Cabo. I personally have seen this circulate quite a few times, and it seems like it gets a little momentum, and then it starts with basically saying like, hey, people that are buying property here, it's not theirs. A lady reached out, and she said, hey, this looks official. And I was like, hey, I've already confirmed this. And I said, if it comes from a guy who was previously the head of Baja California Sur Bar Association, would you believe it? And she said, yes. So I said, okay, I'm going to set that video up for you. And she goes, I knew you were going to do it. Is Cabo on stolen land, per this article?
Well, there's obviously a lot of layers on the issue. I am aware to a certain extent of that particular judgment. And there are similar ones making their ways through the judicial system. The one that you point to particularly, I would not be concerned. It's more hype than actual truth. When the time came for Los Cabos municipal government to basically be incorporated was in 1981. Between 75 and 81, when statehood had been reached in Baja Sur, the capital of La Paz actually expanded all the way south into Los Cabos. So all of the records from the time of even before statehood, which is 74, until the time that the Los Cabos County was incorporated municipal government in 81, all those items should have made it into the registry of the Los Cabos municipal system. It didn't happen as smoothly as it should have. Mind you that almost 50 years ago, the issues were basically that no computer systems were in place, and so a lot of things fell through the cracks. And one of those items were these judgments that had been lodged against the records, but when they transitioned into the new municipal government, it didn't make basically a footprint of the previous state of affairs.
Yeah.
And so they started de novo. They started with new registries and said, hey, I have a property here. This is my clave catastral, my individual key for property taxes. That one was assigned by the new government, and it really basically said, hey, this is a new property, right? This is a new thing. So administratively, it was already identified with that new tax number, property tax number, and the registry recorded that. This judgment of the century basically says, hey, everything that was done beforehand is wrong. It's not the case.
Yeah.
The problem for this plaintiff, for example, in order to make its judgment, come to a full execution of that judgment, they have to win on the merits of the individual buyers that are in the chain of title subsequently to them, right?
If that property changed hands like 5 times,
you would have to go back. And then the initial one, you'd have to say, yeah, this transpired in, let's say, 1950s or 1940s, and there's a private purchase and sale agreement, and then they finally made it into an actual notarized document, which at the time, remember that the first notary public, Armando Aguilar Paniagua, is from the 60s. And he was not a notary per se. He was actually a judge, a lower court judge, that also held the office of notary public in lieu of an actual notary public. When the territory of Baja Sur, because it was not a state, it was administered by the federal district out of Mexico City, that whole area of La Paz basically was under the, let's say, the jurisdiction of this local judge, who also manned the registry. In order for them to execute that judgment, they have to win on the merits against the actual owner of record that appears. So, for example, if you have that judgment, not from whatever the year of that trial of the century goes, but you have one that's current, then that particular person, if for example, the person that approached you and said, well, I'm looking into a certain piece of property, well, you obviously have to go with the certificate of no liens, which records an owner, right? And says, okay, this is the owner of record. The notary public under the notary law only has the obligation to relate the immediately preceding title. He doesn't have to go all the way back to the Civil War.
Yeah.
So he records that. You can get title insurance, which goes farther back. And if you can actually obtain a certificate of no liens from the registry, which is, pretty, it's obviously commonplace because you need to get one for any transaction. It records it X amount of years. Sometimes it's 20 years, sometimes it's 15 years, sometimes it's 10 years. Like from 10 years, this is what we have, right? It's a long explanation because it's not a simple one, but if this particular seller is not the one named in the lawsuit and is lost, then
it doesn't.
Exactly. You would have to then have that individual lawsuit against those.
Okay.
Ones. That's why it's so difficult for this person to execute.
Exactly. So
and just a final point, because I've seen this in Mexico City, where the Azteca Stadium is located. Certain areas were 60 years ago part of the Santa Úrsula Cuapa area, which was Ejidoland, and then it transitioned actually from a expropriation decree into private property through a number of procedures that were in place back then. They did have this particular family, who I actually know this family, had a judgment in their favor at the amparo level. So it was basically a federal suit. And even though they were successful on the merits and they had that, a good friend of mine who was the grandson of the initial claimant had that. And so he basically had to go the route of an alternative way to make this judgment good, which was basically an appraisal. And so that's how it can basically be solved, because it's not uncommon in Mexico to have that. There's another one, which I'm more familiar with, on the other side of the highway that's similar, but there's one piece of land that has already, the defendant has lost in 2017, but they still have possession for a brief period from 2017 to 2020. They had the plaintiffs at possession, and from 2020 to 2024, which is present day, they still have that, but they will be on the outside looking in eventually. So they have a valid one for this one. But that decree of that one is for a more specific period of time and a specific land mass.
Yeah.
That one comprises all the way to where the marina is now located, when there was no marina to speak of.
I've seen this particular article circle back, and what it is, it's like these expat groups on Facebook, and they're like, hey, if you're buying real estate in Cabo, look out. The lady that reached out to me, it's not like she comes down here and buys a place and then 3 years later she's in federal court because she bought stolen. And this is what this morphs into.
Yeah.
So it's like this little whisper, and then people just start running with it.
Yeah. And remember that when they have foreign presence, you have to have a trust in place. So the trustee obviously has legal title, beneficial title is with this particular person, for example, would be in this in the hands of that person that's reaching out to you after a transfer of title occurs. But again, there are safeguards in the process that would basically say, hey, this one I wouldn't worry about, and that's basically to the majority of that area. Just very specific ones might be in trouble simply because they were named and they were part of that. But again, it's not like, hey, this is my land and we're going to kick you out. Eventually, yeah, great. You have to have your day in court. Oído y vencido. Basically, you've been heard and you either won or lost on the merits. Until that happens, you're good with your investment. But yeah, I get it. There is this concern that, what would happen. And the government, the federal government in that case, the one that just stepped in, is somewhat open to certain, justice claims and social claims, trying to say, hey, they got the wrong end of the stick. We're going to come in and try to defend whatever under the guise of foreign ownership is bad, right? And so that's sometimes when things get a little bit more complicated as far as trying to just balance out the interest and the competing interest there, which is, hey, there is, I think, more to benefit with more foreign investment than trying to say, okay, let's see this argument and until the very last and sometimes bitter end. Well, I don't think that's something that this particular person should be worried about. But yeah, it's valid. And then the other part, just as a final part, is title insurance, right? And we've already touched upon this in other interviews. The issue of title insurance, obviously, the chain of title is vetted farther down, in the chain of title rather than just the immediately preceding title. And that way you can have more comfort. And if there's something there, and we just have to, worry about the specific exceptions that were found on that title commitment.
It's gotten to the point where a lot of people will reach out when they get in a bad situation, to let me know what's going on. There's a development in San Lucas. It's about 40% built. People have title. Like it's fine, but the developer has been very bad with construction quality when that was like what they hung their hat on. Let's call it a 100-unit complex. Okay. Gonna mix people up so they don't know what I'm talking about. 100 units, and let's say 40 of them are built. Okay? So 40 have possession.
And you mentioned they have title as well?
Yes, they have title. Now, here's where it gets tricky. The infrastructure within the project was done poorly.
Okay.
Mainly water, okay? So they're blank, Cabo is what? And I'm like, no, this is something with the developer. Now, the owners are basically saying, don't go public with this because it'll hurt our values. And I'm sitting there and like, this developer wants to do more projects. They've already announced it. So the developer has more to lose, but this developer won't do anything unless there's like a lawsuit. So in that situation, what would you say to owners that are worried? Because I've seen this developer too, as soon as like this lady wrote a bad Google review and they were in there fixing something. So they're like very sensitive. However, 50-50 crowd where like 50% are like, hey, we want to bring this. And the other are like, don't do it because it's going to hurt the value. And I'm sitting there, I'm like, get it fixed. Put the developer under pressure.
Yeah, it's obviously good news when people start banding together against the developer simply because of the leverage factor. As a general rule, the developer obviously is the one calling the shots entirely until a condo regime is in place, right? Once it's incorporated, they start selling off those initial pre-sale units and start developing other ones and basically doing that same formula until final completion of the development. The initial role of the developer transitions gradually but surely into a minority position. A lot of times developers have a very hard time trying to adjust their initial role and saying, I'm the one calling the shots, I'm the one that needs to be doing this X, Y, and Z, and I'm the one fronting all of the costs. When those costs start offsetting because of these sales coming through, in the door and having those funds, they then start gradually fading as far as a position of strength, if you will. But they still wield the very big stick because they have inventory left, and sometimes that inventory amounts to a very important percentage of the entire project. That's when minority interests kick in, because it's like, hey, I've been in my unit now, I have title, I've been there a year, and then these things start not falling apart, but certainly water is a very important element to any development. For example, right now I'm looking something in the East Cape. A very known developer also had some issues with craftsmanship of the units and certain things pending on the inventory that they already have. And it's obviously this issue of appreciation. It's gotten to a point where they're probably wanting that land back, even though they've already sold it. And so they're doing everything in their power to kind of say, hey, it's better to just, we'll pay you what you paid us. Hey, let's call it a day. But they want to obviously capitalize on that. And so that's when this particular group of concerned homeowners, transfer of title has occurred. And they said, what do we do? I said, well, first of all, you need to form a front, right? A group of concerned homeowners in a situation. Every individual has, nuances with their transactions. Some of them were offered this or that. Certain things, some are on golf course property, some are on beachfront, some are in the mountains, or they tend to be different. But common issue is that the developer is simply saying, hey, I'm sorry that this has happened to you, but it's really best that you just get we want to get the inventory back, and this is what you paid. And obviously the margins are such that they're trying to get that there. So yeah, I think first of all is having that initial contact with the developer and making known that there are certain warranty periods if that's already passed. Normally it's 2 years, depending on the agreement.
It's still in that period, but the developer has shown.
Yeah, so they sometimes try to push that and say, hey, it's already been 2 years. Like, yeah, but the
developer's not doing anything.
Yeah, and we've made known to you these situations before the warranty period is up, right? Because construction in Mexico is different than in other parts of the world. Here we have rebar, concrete, cement. These types of items are going to last longer than lumber and the type of constructions that are commonplace, mostly in the U.S. and Canada. So what happens is that the hidden defects issue really doesn't come up probably a little bit later. But the developer obviously has the issue of not wanting to go back and fix because of all the cost. Unfortunately, and the price points are out there. I mean, these are pricey units. But as long as they have this common front, then they have an issue there. But even though you can do it on an individual basis and say, hey, I've reached out with my neighbors, they have similar issues. And if it's water, it's a common thing, right? It's the infrastructure. It's like, hey, you need to repair this. The price of the units, the value of the units are going to go down simply because of that. So if this particular developer is sensitive, that's a good thing. That means that they are concerned, and they would be in the minority bracket of being concerned of what social media or what other people would think about the development. That's a good thing, because then you can capitalize on that fear of saying, hey, we want to do the right thing, and what do we need to fix this, rather than just go public. But I would certainly go public.
Well, that's what I'm saying. Is that's
the idea. There's no downside to that. It's exactly. Like, I'm sorry, you're not my friend. You're my seller.
And they need to hear this. And this is what happened. I got on a call. They said, hey, we're so disappointed that we want to sell our property and buy another one. And I told them, I said, look, I'm probably the only agent you'll talk to that would say, let's dive deeper into this, as opposed to selling your property and then selling you another one and double dipping, I'm like, this is messed up, and they need to be held accountable. So
yeah, certainly. And again, the judicial route is the one of last resort, but that's sometimes, unfortunately, the one that really gets their attention. And even though the courts do take long, they do have that stick that's required to say, hey, this needs to happen. And there are ways to get this performance out of the developer unwillingly, right?
Yeah.
But yeah, that's part of it. But again, it's unfortunate, but that's really what happens when, especially markets like Los Cabos are very successful. They say, hey, we have new inventory, you can put this out, and there are examples out there in that area. A developer that had more than 1,000 units already sold, very successful, and it went south.
So last question of the day.
Sure.
Can the Mexican government steal my property?
Well, it's a good question. It's obviously
while we're on the conspiracy theory from the gringos.
Yeah, basically, I guess the term would not be stealing. It would basically be an adverse possession claim against the property because of X, Y, and Z. Really,
by the way, the people that ask this question, they're asking not necessarily Cabo too. They're like Mexico.
Yeah, in Mexico generally. But I mean, the good thing is that in Mexico there is a general law of for example, agrarian items pertaining to ejido land, which is communal property, kind of similar to what you have in the States and Canada, tribal land or ancestral land, where there is a very heavy footprint of the government in favor of this particular sector of the population. That's really the only area that the government really can step in and say, hey,
ejido land.
Ejido land.
Exactly.
Say,
We're talking about private property.
Yeah, and private property, again, and I just wanted to make that clear because, again, if it's private property, then there are, certain things that happens as a chain of title. If you reach far enough, all land initially belonged to the Mexican government, right? We have private property rights. We have those rights granted in our Constitution. And more recently, 20 years ago, there was a reform in Article 1 where all the rights afforded to Mexican individuals are afforded to foreigners under the human rights rationale. So with that in mind, it's not that the government can step in and take. Why? Simply because in the event, in the case of Cabo, this is not necessarily the case in other places, but basically the areas of coastal areas and borderland where there are trusts in place. And the trustees are Mexican banks, they're entities. So they hold title for the benefit of the foreigner. So they can't, even them, they hold legal title. They're obviously under a legal obligation to respect that land. So you can't go one layer up and say, the government can simply say, whatever you have in there, we're taking by force, right? And so we're not there. We hopefully will never get to that point where they are not respecting private property because, again, that's the Constitution, and it's been like that for more than 100 years. And I don't see anything currently that would rise to the level of having a new constitution, which would basically 86 the current framework of private property, which again stems from even farther back than 100 years, when we've been around as a country for 200 years independently. Look at the track record of Mexico. They have honored that private property regime, even for Mexican nationals. And from 1973 going forward, with the changes in the foreign investment law through the trust, they started initially in Tijuana region. They gave them 15 years as a permit to do that. They've respected that. The only one that really made the news, and you're probably too young to remember this, but this was 2001.
It's like Tijuana or
Punta Banda.
Okay.
Punta Banda. And that's the one where Ejido wasn't concerned. So it was like people were fine.
But that was not private property.
That was not private property. And that's exactly why they were kicked out. And like, I have all these savings. Like, I'm sorry, but there is no insurance for stupidity. When you come in and you have a price point that's so attractive, there's a reason why it's so cheap, right? There has to be a catch, and there normally is. So that's when you do have to have counsel in place, simply because you're talking about your well-earned investments through X amount of years to just come in and say, okay, I have $100,000 to invest, or even more. Just do your homework, and it's basic. It's like, what are the price points? And that's a little bit, off camera. We were discussing, the role of the broker, which is not only, finding desirable property and marketing it and having, the ability to reach out to potential buyers, but it's what I like to call the first line of defense. A good broker is not only the one who would represent the interests of buyer or seller, depending on what side of the equation they're on, but also one who would do at least the initial legwork of saying, hey, I've spoken with the developer who's marketing this property. If not himself or herself, I've reached out to people that are in the know, i.e. attorneys, who have been able to review title. Just simply by having that initial work done, whatever is being presented to them as property that is ready to be purchased, there's that comfort level, because the interaction between the broker and the client is probably closer even than counsel and the client. Why? Because they rely on that. Why? Because there's also a cultural thing. A lot of brokers are foreign in Mexico, and the buyers are foreign. So they have this additional rapport saying, hey, I trust this person. But this person should not only be interested in the commission, but also should be interested in not having additional headaches down the road. And just because something might be good on paper, doesn't mean it's touched. And even then, even if you do your homework,
thinking long term.
Yeah, exactly. And then you have issues that come up that sometimes they come from left field. We know a specific development that at one point one would recommend saying, "Hey, this is a good development." They have other properties throughout Mexico they've developed successfully, and unfortunately, things sometimes don't get off the ground, and that's not on the broker. I get that, but what's on the broker, I believe, is pushing certain properties that have a lot of hair on them, but because of the interest of having this commission, they step in on sometimes a landmine, and then they start getting into trouble because then they start recommending the property and even going as far and saying, oh yeah, this is the way you should structure your purchase because it's easier, because taxes are saved, because this and that. And that's when people get into trouble. And as I say, our role as attorneys specifically is selling this confidence of saying, hey, I've looked at this. You're good. I'm not here to jeopardize your money that has been hard earned, but rather making your investment grow. And one thing that I can do is obviously after the broker initially has vetted something and saying, hey, this is what we have, I certainly want to look at that. And then the other part, and I've had this recently come up in 2 transactions specifically, where sometimes the roles are confused and then the seller says, I don't want to have counsel in place. Who's going to do all the work that's required to get to the point of transfer of title with the notary? I'm on the buyer side, for example. I'm not going to do certain things that are on the sales side. And then the broker, as far as the communication went, really didn't help things.
Yeah.
To explain that, hey, I get it. You want to save on whatever costs are associated with that representation, but you need to get your buyer all the information. And obviously the broker has a benefit of getting that commission, but also explaining that role. And for some reason, they were very close together, these 2 transactions. And I said, hey, when Fletcher comes around, I'd like to just, discuss that, because again, that would have been avoided if the broker was open enough initially to say to seller, hey, I get it. You don't want to have someone in place, but who are you going to have? Maybe a property manager that can probably trust.
Yeah, well, that's just them being lazy and wanting a commission, and
yeah, exactly. And then blaming.
That's not my problem.
And then that blaming, like, hey, yeah, this is because the council didn't do that. Well, I did what needed to be done on the purchase side, but I'm not going to do things that are required on the sales side. And so that's really the role. But again, everything should transition smoothly, and that good relationship between brokers and buyers, throughout the process is good to have. And I've had very successful transactions with brokers that know this part. They don't overstep their bounds, but they also help explaining it, because again, they probably have more experience than I do as far as this interaction between, hey, this property, what about you? They have comps. They have all these added elements of basically convincing, a particular purchaser to say, hey, this is a better option than this one, or depending on what your needs are. And that's why, and obviously we're here just to confirm that things are above board, that everything is proper. But again, it is a foreign country. If you're looking at this from elsewhere, Mexico is very formal. It's a jurisdiction that loves this type of very strict procedure. But the safeguards that are in place, I think, are better than most countries. We have, centralized public property registry. We have notary publics. We have an obligatory system to record your title. You do know who your seller is. That's not the case in the States. There might be a covenant that's aside from the chain of title. That's why you get title insurance in the States, and it's more commonplace because you don't have that. You have title insurance in Mexico, maybe for some other reasons, but not necessarily because this one is like, well, I'm not sure if this particular developer, this particular seller has correct title. And in Mexico, it's like, well, that really doesn't happen. And on paper, you have these added benefits, but just to open up with that question, the government cannot steal your property. There are safeguards in place, and obviously Mexico is a party to several treaties that tend to also increase the level of areas that need to be invested in and be protected, not only under our Constitution, but also under international conventions that Mexico is a party to. A little bit technical for a Friday.
No, that'll work. That'll work. That might be the end of the workday for me, though. But, yeah.
All right.
Thank you, Eduardo.